Chapter 8 is all about the psychology of memory, so let's get started with that. So, memory has been studied before psychology was a formal discipline, trying to understand how we remember events that happened to us, how we can recall information that was presented to us earlier, how we can learn behaviors and skills and then never forget how to do them, such as riding a bike or playing a song on the piano. All of these different modes of recalling things that happened in the past are the modes of memory. So we'll look at the behavioral memories or the memories of events that unfolded, as well as memory of information, and then a little bit about how we forget and maybe some of the disorders associated with forgetting. What's interesting with the psychology of memory is that it became a formal study in the 60s and 70s when computers were becoming more popular. So most of the vocabulary of memory has been borrowed from computer science. Notice here we have encoding, which is taking information and finding a place to put it in our, whether it's in our brains or in our nervous system. Sometimes memories can be distributed across our body, which is why certain actions can bring back or evoke certain memories. Storage, like there's a filing cabinet where memories can be placed, or on a computer random access memory drive, information can be put or files can be put. And then retrieval, going back into the system and finding where the memory is located. So notice, if you have a conversation with a friend and the next day you don't remember or you misremember some detail of that conversation, maybe you decided to meet them at a particular place and time and you show up and they don't, and so someone was wrong, someone made a mistake. We don't know if that mistake was or the mistake occurred at the level of encoding. Was it never filed to begin with, or was there a misunderstanding of how to file it? When it got stored, was there something faulty with the storage location or the process of actually filing it away? Or is it there and you simply went to the wrong place to look for it? All you know is that a memory was misremembered, or information was misremembered, or you couldn't find it. But when you have an experience like that, it's impossible to know where the mistake occurred. So memory psychologists try to test that. So encoding is that process of putting information somewhere for the long term, making sure it sticks around so you can go find it at a later date. Some things happen without even trying to remember it. Maybe there's a song that you actually wish you could forget, but it's been stored, and so it got coded automatically. And sometimes, such as when you're studying for an exam and you're trying to memorize lots of concepts, it's very difficult to store that information, or you find like an information overload, and so that's when you have to like do lots of rehearsal and practice and testing and reviewing, and so you've learned a lot of the steps of building a stronger memory or memorizing information through your years and years of schooling, I trust. So then there's the next part, the encoding step. And again, all of this language is borrowed from computer processing. And some psychologists, and I'm among them, argue that this is a limited way, or it's a limited way of looking at memory and trying to understand it. And it limits how we understand the whole process of memory. So I think it limits how much we can do to better understand memory. But anyway, it's the vocabulary that we have. So sometimes you can remember things based on how they sound, or what they mean. Semantic encoding is the encoding of words and their meanings. So if I were to tell you to think about a fire engine or a fire truck, my guess is, along with that, you would have like the color red, because those are mostly red. Fire hydrants are yellow or red. Maybe the fireman's outfit or firewoman's outfit is yellow. You think of like the Dalmatian dog that rides along. So there's all of these meanings that are associated with a fire engine or a fire truck and all of the people that are involved with that process. And maybe you see fire or a building that's on fire and smoke. All of these things have meanings that are related. And so if you have a new experience, let's say you had COVID-19 for the first time, you're probably going to file that away with other experiences you've had of headaches and fevers and maybe a positive test of something. All of that, or the hospital, the clinic, feeling ill, tired, lethargic. You're going to file all that together in a related location. So it's going to bring back memories of similar experiences. Sometimes we encode things visually, so we remember what it looks like. There's also remembering smells and remembering sounds. And so maybe like if you remember an old aunt or uncle that you haven't seen for a long time and you remember what they look like. So, oh yeah, Aunt Linda, I can see her face, or Uncle Ben, I remember the pipe smoke and like what it smelled like. And so we can have memories that are tied to these different sense systems. All right, so here is a specific model of how we remember. And so let's see, we have, it's really tiny. Let me look. All right, the central executive, interesting. Phenomenological loop, episodic buffer, and visuospatial loop. Oh no, it's phonological, not phenomenological. The point here, and with most of these models of memory, is that in order to take an experience and store it away for the long term, there's got to be some system of encoding it, some way of making sense of it so that you have a way of retrieving it. Think of it as putting a file into a folder, but then giving the folder a handle so that when you reach for it, you can recognize the handle and you can pull it out more quickly. Otherwise, if you just file a manila folder away and there's a million other manila folders, you won't know where the one you're looking for is. So sometimes you can repeat the word multiple times and develop a familiarity with it and tie the memory to the sound of that word. That's the phonological loop. The episodic buffer would be, I'm assuming here, I haven't read Badley and Hitch's models myself, but an episodic buffer has to do with an experience that we've had. And so we remember it like we're watching a show, like an episode of a show, a beginning, middle, and end, a storyline therein, and we can encode it that way. And then the visual spatial sketchpad, this is like a memory for something that we saw, and maybe it is familiar in some ways, or we recognize it or compare it to other images that we've seen or can relate to. So there needs to be some means of taking an experience or taking information and storing it long term. And so those are the three main pathways. And it looks like in this model, each pathway is reciprocal. So we might have an experience that we play in our minds like a tape, and then, or a DVD, or a YouTube video. And then it goes back, so we store it as that video, and then we kind of recall it as that video, and so there's a back and forth process, and through that loop we get the long-term memory, and then we need to recall it occasionally or from time to time in order for that memory to persist or last a long time. Then there is the A to S model. And this proposes that information passes through three distinct stages in order for it to be stored in a long-term memory. So here we've got some sort of information comes in through the senses, and we can store it as a sensory memory. So we might, let's say like you burn your hand on a stove, and it's just like you remember what that feels like, stored away permanently. But it can also, maybe it's not that memorable and you have to kind of rehearse it and think about it. And so you start, okay, I just touched the stove, my hand hurts. I'm going to kind of reflect on that. And after I've thought about it for a while, it can get transferred into long-term memory. Actually, forgive me. It looks like the sensory memory, if it isn't rehearsed, will not get transferred. It will be lost. So the A to S model proposes that if you burn your hand in a stove and don't think about it, that memory will be lost forever. So you have to be like, oh my God, my hand hurts or my finger hurts. You have to have that self-reflection, that period, the recursive thinking about it in order for it to be stored into long-term memory. And only then do you get to the long-term memory. Otherwise, you'll forget about it. I don't know how I feel about that, because I think it's possible to have a remarkable experience that you don't dwell on, that you, I guess if it's a remarkable experience, you will dwell on it. So I guess that's where the model comes from. All right, so now we've got the list of types of memories. A sensory memory, so that was the very first step here in the 8th S model. A sensory memory will happen even if we're not aware of it, and we'll hold it for a little bit. So if I were to hear music outside, I might not even notice that it's happening. And if I don't ever recognize it or think about it, it'll just disappear and it'll never get stored, even though the sound, the sound waves did hit my ears, and I did kind of register something, even though I wasn't aware of it. We can hold memories for a brief period of time, tenths of a second up to, I guess, a couple of seconds. But once we start attending to it and noticing it, a deeper, more complex process is happening. So this was done, I don't know that this slideshow is going to go into details, but this was done in a laboratory setting where students were asked to solve math problems, and so they're focused on these math problems, but then they told them information that was irrelevant to the math problems. Maybe someone was reciting lines from a poem, I forget exactly, but students were focused on solving the math problems, and it was really important that they do so. So they had an urgency there, or a focus there. And then after they did these math problems, they asked them questions about the words that were being spoken to them, and they didn't remember these words unless they asked them about it immediately after they heard them. So there was a period of time when information was coming in, even though they weren't focused on it, that they could answer questions about that information, even though they weren't aware of it. And so that just shows that sensory input is being stored very briefly, or it's being acknowledged for a very brief moment of time before it's discarded. All right, so the Stroop effect is a phenomenon of, I would say, perception, but it looks like it was discovered studying memory. I guess it has to do with how we store information. So when I ask you how you store information about the color red, do you remember the word red or the color red? And the answer is both, but there's one system, color, or I guess letters, the semantic structure of the word, or rather the shape of the word. One of those two methods you rely on more than the other. And I don't know what the distribution is between college students, but some remember the color and others remember the word. So this was shown by this Stroop test, and in order to do the Stroop test, there's two ways, or two trials. In trial one, you read the words that are printed, and so you go through it. The top line would be red, blue, and yellow. So I'm just reading the words that are printed, and I am text dominant, so I have a very easy time just reading the words by focusing on the letters. But if you are color dominant, you're going to have trouble doing that. You're going to want to say blue instead of red because you see the color blue. And so the way you do the test, first you read through all of them just by looking at the letters, and then note each time you made a mistake and how long it took you. Then you go back and just say the color and ignore the letters. So then the top line here would be blue, orange, and red, maroonish, which I can do, but it takes a lot more focus. And then obviously, like the faster you go, the more easy it is for you to make mistakes. So try it both ways. Try to say the words by looking at the letters, and then say the colors by just looking at the hue of the letters. You'll find that you're dominant one way or the other. All right, so short memory can be divided into short-term memory and long-term memory, although and sensory memory or sensory register. Although there's a very interesting article that shows that these distinctions, so sensory memory, which is like information that we have access to very briefly, short-term memory, where we're kind of focusing on something like trying to remember a website URL or the numbers to a code to try to do a dual factor authentication, like rehearsing the numbers in your head, that's short-term memory. And then long-term memory, this is a memory you store away and you can pull it up weeks, months, years from now. There's actually more, these three forms of memory share more in common than difference. There's a lot of overlap. So I forget the name of that article right now, but this was, I think, back in the 70s. So the idea that there are these distinct frames of memory is a little bit misleading, but they're somewhat helpful for understanding what's going on. So short-term memory is what we can hold in our thoughts right now, and psychologist George Miller recognized that we can hold about 7 items in this short-term memory. So conveniently, phone numbers are 7 numbers long, and we can also chunk those things. So in Albany, the area code is 229. So I don't have to remember 2 and then 2 and then 9. I just know that 229 is the area code. So that's one item. And then the phone number I'm trying to remember. So if it's at Albany State University, the next 3 numbers are always 500. So I don't need to remember my department chair's full phone number. I just remember the last 4 digits because I know it's going to be 229, 500, something. And so if I had to remember all 9 digits, or I guess all 10 digits, I would have trouble because we can only hold about 7 items in that short-term memory. And sometimes slightly more, sometimes slightly less. That's the way it calls it, 7 items plus or minus 2. You can probably find that article by just typing in 7 items plus or minus 2 and the name George Miller and PDF, and you'll find that article, which is a pretty interesting read. If we do some means of long-term storage, then short-term memory can pass into long-term memory. And one of those ways of doing it is just repeating the number over and over and over again in your head. So then long-term memory can be stored a couple of different ways. Looks like there are explicit and implicit types of memories. So the explicit memories may be an event or a series of words, and then implicit memories are such as an emotion that we feel or some behavior that we do or a performance. Learning how to swing a tennis racket, for example, you practice over and over again. Eventually, it becomes second nature. That would be a procedural memory. Oh, we've got the actual breakdown. So I went through those 2 already. So you can take a more careful look at those 2 things. We've got semantic and episodic memories, and then procedural memories here in the implicit memories. A good practice would be to come up with examples of each of those. And then finally, retrieval. How do we go into our memories and get the memories that have been stored? And so there are 3 basic ways here outlined on this slide. We can simply remember the information. And so, what was the name of the actor that played so-and-so? You're going back into your memory and finding the information and grabbing it. That's one of the more difficult ways of recalling or retrieving information. Recognition. So on a lot of times, like multiple choice exams ask for this recognition. So of these 4 names, which was the father of humanistic psychology? And so you look at the names and you don't have to recall the name, which would be if they just gave you a blank line, which would be a lot harder, but you can see if you recognize one of them as being associated with humanistic psychology. So that's another way of doing it. And then relearning, so this is practicing a skill that you've already learned or remembering something that you had learned years earlier. And there's good evidence to show that if you learned a bunch of concepts or like college algebra in the past and now like you've forgotten about it and have to learn it again, the pathways are still kind of there even if you don't remember all of the information, so you can relearn something easier the second time. All right, so what parts of the brain are involved in memory? Carl Lashley was an American neuroscientist or neuropsychologist. I believe he was at Harvard. He was looking for evidence of an engram, or a group of neurons that helped facilitate memory. And eventually they got to the hippocampus. And is that going to be here, listed here? Oh, that's horrible. He conducted experiments on rats. And so we saw in the learning chapter that rats were used in mazes to see how long it took them to learn how to solve a maze and if they could do it quickly the next time around. And so that would be evidence that they learned something about that environment. And so if rats can learn how to get through a maze quicker, what happens if we start destroying parts of their brain? And Lashley hypothesized that if you destroyed the right part of the brain, that the rats would be incapable of solving the maze repeatedly, so they wouldn't improve on each subsequent trial. And one of the problems with doing that is if you destroy a part of the brain, this is neuroplasticity, another part of the brain will take over for the function that was lost. So, Lashley was unable to find that location. Yikes, I didn't know that about Carl Lashley. So here we've got the midbrain here, and the prefrontal cortex is in blue. The midbrain is there in the middle. It looks like the big hole. And then down below it, we've got the amygdala, which is responsible for some of our what we call negative emotions. And then the hippocampus is just behind the amygdala, and the cerebellum is there in the back. And remember, we've got episodic memories, semantic memories, and procedural memories. All of these areas are responsible for storing memories. And so emotional memories are going to be stored in the amygdala. Procedural memories are going to be stored in the cerebellum. Memories of who we are and what makes us unique will be stored in the prefrontal cortex along with the amygdala, hippocampus, and cerebellum. And the hippocampus is responsible for episodic memories. And there they are listed out. And the big one that you'll hear a lot is about the hippocampus. So without a properly functioning hippocampus, it's very difficult to store especially semantic memories and episodic memories into long-term storage. Why do you have to know about neurotransmitters here? Of course, if it's happening in the brain, neurotransmitters are involved. Okay, I can see a connection here. It has to do with state-dependent memory. This is interesting. If you drink alcohol regularly, and let's say you drink alcohol and play poker, and you only ever play poker when you're drinking alcohol. Poker is a card game. A lot of times gambling is involved. And you learn the rules of poker while you're drunk. If you were sober, let's say a month later, you would have trouble remembering the rules of poker. You would have to get drunk in order to remember, to recall what those rules are. I actually experienced this in college. I did a lot of drinking wine and playing the piano, and I got pretty good playing the piano with a buzz. And I tried playing one time after I'd been doing this for a while. I tried playing sober, and I struggled to do it. Now I have the opposite problem. I only ever play when I'm sober, and if I've had a drink, everything kind of falls apart. This is state-dependent memory. So the arousal of your body, how excited you are, how tired and lethargic you are. All of those things matter when you store information. If you're anxious in the classroom, actually, a lot of students have test anxiety. And so they sit down for the test and now they're like really anxious and they have trouble remembering what they know because they stored it when they were calm. And so it would be helpful to become, if you memorize something when you're calm, you'll have an easier time remembering it if you're calm. If you try to remember it when you're like in the state of arousal or anxiety, you're going to struggle to remember it. So the neurological and neurotransmitter release, the state that your body is in, as represented by the neurotransmitter availability, is going to influence what you remember and then what you can recall. Okay, so specifically arousal theory in memories has to do with when you have strong emotions, there's a really strong impulse to store that as a memory. So you'll remember maybe the first time you got kissed or you kissed somebody, and that was you had a really strong emotional pull there, and that memory got stored forever. You'll never forget that. Or I remember where I was when the planes hit the World Trade Center. So on September 9, or September 11th, 2001. Like I remember where I was and who I was sitting next to in my class. I was in high school. And so that's a flashbulb memory. There's the example of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which I wasn't alive for, Martin Luther King Jr., but I do remember the September 11 attacks. So these are called flashbulb memories, and it's this really strong emotional and social experience that kind of firmly plants a memory. All right, so let's talk about some of the problems with memory. Amnesia is probably the most common one, or the one you're most likely to hear about. I don't know about it being common. Amnesia is simply the inability to recall long-term memories. But keep in mind that there's two forms of that. So is it the inability to store new long-term memories, or is it the inability to recall memories that were already stored? So we've got anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. So with anterograde amnesia, this is, antero is after the fact. So this is inability to remember new information after the point of a trauma. So it's possible to have a head injury or get into a car accident, sustain a head injury, and then not be able to remember any new information. So you'll remember your name, where you're from, everything you studied so far, but from that point on, you will be unable to create new long-term memories. Then there's retrograde amnesia. This is a loss of something that happened before the accident. So this would be like you have an accident and you don't remember the last, pretty common is you don't remember the last 3 hours or hour or 30 minutes. There's a period of time before the accident that's completely blacked out. You can still form new memories, but there's a period that you've completely lost. And if extreme, the period is very long, perhaps your entire life. Just some vocabulary words. Construction is what you call the formation of a new memory. Reconstruction is bringing up old memories. It's important to remember that our long-term memory is susceptible to transformation during the reconstruction process. So it's very easy to have someone manipulate your long-term memories. You might think and even you manipulating your long-term memories so that they more closely resemble what you want to remember. So let's say like you had an embarrassing experience, and if you want to avoid the pain of that memory, you might, or like you made a huge mistake, you might misremember details that favor you, and you're not trying to be deceitful. It's just that our long-term memories aren't that reliable. So there's some pretty good research done about that, particularly in cases of like murder and rape where the victims, obviously not in murder, but in rape, where the victims misremembered facts about their accuser. And And so suggestibility is a concern when you're talking about long-term memory. So here we've got the eyewitness misidentification. Are they going to give maybe the name of that psychologist will come to me. She was from Washington, I believe. So eyewitness misidentification was responsible for 70+% of wrongful convictions. Forensic science actually was responsible for just under 50% of wrongful convictions. False confessions are less common. Elizabeth Loftus, that was the person I was thinking of. So she studied the formation of false memories. There were 2 sets of experiments that she did. I'll let you read about them. You can also watch videos. She's got a few TED Talks about these, and she gives you opportunities to test yourself on this misinformation effect. But it was very damning for eyewitness testimony, and now eyewitness testimony is still relied on for some reason, even though it's highly suspect. So one of the studies, she had people watch a car accident and then be asked information about it later. But there were some pretty clever ways the questions were asked that changed your memories of it. So watch her TED Talk and go through some of those examples if you're interested. Hey, Adelaide. False memory syndrome. Oh, let's go back to repressed and recovered memories. So is it possible for you to experience something that's so traumatic that you try to shove that memory down in your unconsciousness so that you don't have to think about it anymore? It can be compelling to think that, I had a horrible accident or I watched somebody die. I just want to forget it ever happened and just push it down. There was a lot of belief in psychoanalysis that our personalities are shaped largely by these repressed memories. The problem with that is, how can we verify that we have a repressed memory if it's repressed, if we don't have access to it? So psychoanalysts convince their patients, their clients, their analysans, that something horrible happened to them, and they started to believe something horrible, such as being molested by an uncle or an aunt. And then so there would be these convictions and accusations that happened decades later. I can't believe what you did to me. My analyst helped me remember this repressed memory. And so what psychologists have shown is that beliefs like this can be taught, or memories can be given to somebody. You can actually implant false memories. And that's Loftus's second series of studies. And so you have to be very careful when you're dealing with memories. There's a chance that the memory, you're misremembering it, or it's possible that it never happened. What she did for this is she told random people that they had been lost as a child in a department store, even though she checked with parents and siblings, and there was no memory of this, but they told these students that it had happened to them, and then these students were asked to recall that day, and at first they're like, I don't remember that, but then after a couple of trials, they were like, yeah, I remember what I was wearing, and I was crying, and there was this old man that helped me find my mom. They put these memories together, even though it had never happened to them. But she was able to convince them that it did, and they concocted a story. Man, why do we forget? This is a tough topic, because I think it's really complicated. So look at these, nickels. And try to remember, I recognize that they're nickels, but if you asked me to draw one, I wouldn't be able to, I could draw a circle, and I know there's a face on it, but I don't know whose face, or what words are written on it. They all kind of look like nickels to me. If I were to guess, this is the one that we use. I mean, I recognize that they were nickels, at least, but I couldn't produce that on my own. So how did I forget? Well, no, I never really paid that much attention to it. So there are all sorts of, we're confronted with lots of information all the time, lots of complex experiences, and we remember what we remember, which is very little. Then we construct narratives to fill in the gaps, and it can help when we have visual access to something to corroborate our memories. But I guess I don't really look at nickels very much anymore, but I wouldn't do much better with a $20 bill. Or even like my credit, like I use my credit card more than anything. I could draw the shape of it, but I don't know like if there's an image on it or if there's anything on the front of my card, to be honest. Or if the name of the credit card company is on it, and if so, where. I don't know, even though I use it every day. So this would be encoding failures, that we never like actually take the time to store it long term. And then if we do store things long term, how come we have trouble recalling them, or we recall that information incorrectly? So Schachter's got 7 sins of memory, and I'm not familiar with this concept of 7 sins of memory, but let's go through them real quick. Transience, that would be something that just lasts for a very short period. So that would be over a long enough time horizon, we'll forget most information if we're not asked to rehearse it again. So like maybe you learned a language in high school and you haven't been asked to use it in years and years and you forget most of it. Absent-mindedness, we just simply weren't paying attention, so no encoding happened. Blocking, this would be the information is there, but for some reason you can't access it. That's called like the tip of the tongue phenomenon. I am horrible with names. Like I'll see a student and I'll recognize that they were a student, and I'll usually know what class they were in and what year I had them, but I don't remember their name. And I'll remember it 5 minutes later. And it's just the mental context that I'm in, like preparing for another class, thinking about my current students, all of those things just temporarily block the name. And I'll see them, I'll remember something about them, but then like I won't remember their name. But 5 minutes later, I'll be in the bathroom, I'll go, oh yes, I remember who that was now. Misattribution, that's when maybe you know of a quote, maybe a quote that you live by, but you don't remember where it came from. And so you say, oh yeah, I think that was Einstein, but really it was like your uncle drunk at a Thanksgiving party. Suggestibility we mentioned, false memories, bias, and that's having memories that are distorted by what you want to believe, what you hope to believe, and then persistence. So this is the opposite. This is when you want to forget something but can't. How long does it take for you to forget something once you've learned it? Not very long. Look at this. The red curve shows the decline of memory as a factor of time. The x-axis there on the bottom is a period of time. So the very far right, and it's an exponential x-axis. So the far right line is 31 days. In the middle is 24 hours. So between, looks like 20 minutes and 6 days, there's not a huge change in memory. You've already lost more than half of it. So you might learn something interesting in the classroom, and then before you get home or get to your dorm room, you've forgotten more than half of it. That's usually semantic memories. Bias, I've kind of already gone through these, so I'll let you read the different types of bias because I'm starting to get tired and I feel like this lecture is dragging on longer than it should. Persistence I've mentioned, so I've defined these in a previous slide, but here you can see examples of each of them. Interference, this is when something prevents us from storing new information. So it could be past memories contradict new information, so the past can interfere with the present, or retroactive interference. Oh, this is when new experiences distort old memories, I believe. Yeah. How can you enhance memory? Well, just keep in mind, I wanted to say remember, keep in mind that in order to store something long term, there has to be attention directed to it, time, and you have to be systematic about it. So don't expect to remember something that you don't spend time focused on and trying to remember. Mnemonic devices are a way to connect new memories to something that you already know. Here are eight different skills you can practice in order to improve your study habits. If the goal, of course, is trying to remember information.